Assalamu alaikum everyone. Good evening and a very warm welcome to Supply Chain Talks. Thank you for joining us in today's live webinar. And the topic of today's webinar is from strategy to execution, leading large-scale supply chain transformation. I'm Noman Ali, founder and CEO of Supply Chain Talks, and I'm delighted to be your host for this session. Today we have with us a highly experienced industry leader, Jameel Hye. He is a supply chain transformation director with more than 15 years at Mars and a career coach for supply chain professionals. One of the most decorated and respected career coaches that I have seen around. So anything around that topic, you can connect him with him on us separately as well. Jameel brings deep hands-on experience in leading transformation across complex supply chain environments. And I'm confident that today's discussion will offer practical insights for professionals and leaders working to move from strategy into measurable execution. Because a lot of transformation, they go wrong in not just in strategy, but actual execution and leading that execution or transformation. Large scale supply chain transformation is not only about technology or process redesign. It is about building the right ambition, aligning the stakeholders, both internal and external, managing change across all functions, directly linked and indirectly linked as well, and creating the capabilities needed to sustain performance over time. These are exactly the themes we will explore in today's conversation. During this session, we will be discussing what typically triggers transformation, why many programs struggle during the execution, how governance can be structured across functions, what drives success in initiatives such as APS, VMIs, and the ERPs, and how leaders can balance quick wins with long-term capability. For everyone joining us live, thank you once again for your time. I encourage you to stay with us throughout the session. Reflect on the discussion in the context of your own organization and share this webinar with colleagues in supply chain, logistics, planning, procurement, manufacturing, and operations. With that, let us begin. Jameel, it is a pleasure to have you with us today. Welcome to Supply Chain Talks.
Thanks a lot, Noman, and thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be on Supply Chain Talks, and I'm a big follower of the content and the great work you are doing in the Middle East region. So it's an honor to be here.
Much appreciated. So I think, thank you for the kind words. So Jameel, to set the stage for our audience, let me begin with the foundational question around what typically triggers the need for large-scale transformations, and how would you define a clear transformation ambition and scope from the very start?
Absolutely. I think it's a great question, Noman. So first of all, let me just touch a little bit upon like what triggers transformation. And before even I do that, I just want to touch on something very important, that transformation, in my opinion, is one of the most overused terms in the world of supply chain. Because sometimes I've seen companies are actually doing system transitions and they call them transformation. I think transformation is something which happens as a result of a major disruption. So what really triggers a transformation, what I have seen in my almost 20 plus years in the supply chain industry, is that there could be 2 or 3 major drivers, right? So one example which I've seen a lot is that you identify a single point of failure in your supply chain as a result of a major disruption, right? And then there's a huge urgency around like eliminating that. That could be one reason. Another one, especially in the CPG world, could be around a change in consumer behavior, right? So certainly, let's say over time we realize that consumers are shifting their trend and they are trying to consume slightly different products within your same niche, right? So certainly then you have to roll up your sleeves and start thinking about like how are we going to transform a supply chain to meet the metrics of this new type of product, right? And then finally, it could be around cost, and I think those transformations have become more and more frequent now, especially in this decade, because this is, in my opinion, like this is a decade when the books will be written about supply chain. On this decade, it will be a little bit of a love-hate relationship, right? Because while Supply chains are under massive stress because of initially COVID, then wars happening. Right now, there is an oil crisis going on. But at the same time, what all these issues have really brought supply chain to the center stage is the importance of the work that is done, right? And I can see that as companies have embarked on transformational journeys, they have also evolved their organizational structures, and a lot of other sub functions like planning, for instance, has become much more important in supply chain than it used to be before.
So true, and I will pick on your planning part. Like over here at SCT right now, we are involved in two major projects around planning transformation, digitizing the planning. One is for a retail company across Saudi, and the other one is a very complex manufacturing. So we are not just doing demand and supply; we are also doing APS as well. So, and you are so right that planning has suddenly become center stage when it comes to transformation topics, that people are realizing that transformation is beyond the traditional ERP implementation. And then usually after the ERP, they used to talk about the WMS as a maximum, nothing else. Over
That's
there, the
right.
transformation used to stop. But now, we get to know that there is planning, and planning is just one small topic. Then you have spend management and these things. So when we talk about supply chain alone, there is a huge array of opportunities for transformation. So I agree with you. So coming to our next question, that what are the most common reasons transformation fail? And I've seen multiple fail myself. That even that I was involved in one of them and I was advising, but it failed because it turned out wrong product selected, kind of thing. So what is your take on that?
Yeah, I think it's a very important question to think about, Noman. And I think what I've seen, once again, based on all the experiences I've gained over these years, is there could be three or four major reasons, and I want to touch briefly on each of those. I think the first one I see is because transformation projects are normally like multi-year projects, right? This is not something which you will do in 3 months and you are be done, right? Because you are changing most of the time multiple systems and a lot of people are impacted and so on. One very common reason I've seen why transformations fail is because there is a business strategy change mid-flight. It's a little bit of the same issue in the corporate world that happens, for example, in the world of politics, right? Politicians work for a 4-year term, and sometimes they might be making decisions which are not good for the long term because they are only focused on getting re-elected, right? So I think that similar problem happens when, let's say, a GM is there for 2 to 3 years. He will start a massive transformation project, but mid-flight, let's say, the leadership changes, and suddenly the new leadership comes, and for them, that transformation may be still important, but now the metrics are different. Like I mean, I can recall one very vivid example where we started a major project, or I would call it a major transformation, because once again, it was pretty complex, and it was all about cost optimization, right? And then suddenly mid-flight, was change in leadership comes, and they are now talking about service, right? And of course, service is definitely always important, but then the way you approach the transformation when you initially set your goals, now you are putting it's almost like a scope creep into it, right? So first of all, like that strategy consistency is very important for transformations not to fail. Secondly, strategy, in my opinion, is, I think the best definition of strategy which I've seen and observed is strategy is more about what you will not do versus what you will do. So what happens is that you start a major project, and then suddenly there are all these micro projects popping up all the way, and then the business is unable to make some clear prioritization decisions, right? So if you are going on a major transformation, right, you have to really make it a priority. So, and that's where the strategic choices come, because if you have got, let's say, the same pool of key users who are working on like 15 different projects, you will not be able to deliver your transformation, because like these people are, the resources are spread out thin. The third factor which I see is lack of dedicated resources, right? If you are doing a transformation, I think this is one of the fundamental differences between a project and a transformation, is that you need to put dedicated resources to run that transformation, and you need to sometimes pull the best people out of your operations to run it. If you tell somebody that, oh, you are going to work on this major transformation project 20% of your time, and you are one of the most critical key users in that whole change, it's not going to work. And then finally, talking of change, is the change management piece itself, right? And I know, once again, change management, like transformation, once again, is a very abused term in supply chain. But I must call out, Noman, that when we do change management, 90% of companies' attention is on the systems change management. Okay, we are moving from this APS to this APS. We are moving from this WMS to that WMS, right? And this is how the process maps are going to change and all of that. But if we spend at least half of that time thinking about the impact on people change management, and within people change management, there's one very important concept I want to touch on, which we'll also cover later in your questions, is the concept of dialogue, day in the life of. So if you have got like 10 major users of that system which is changing, how will their day in the life of change once this new way of working is implemented, right? Are they trained for that? They were probably key users for a different system and a different process. Now they need to be upgraded. Who is working on that, right? And then mid-flight, like let's say if your key user, finds another job and leaves, how are we really making sure that there is proper pipeline backfilling happening? So I think those are the 4 reasons which I see to answer your question.
No, I agree, and let me share my few insights as well. And this is what I usually talk about when I'm talking about transformation. That transformation is around 3 P's, and the 3 P's are: the first one is the people, and the second one is the process, and the third one becomes a product. That what you are transforming, what is the product that you want to transform. So if you don't have the right people, or you do not, as you said, the dedicated teams are there, so you cannot, as you said, rightly said, I've seen transformations fail because you had someone, an operations manager, leading the topic, but he's also need to deliver everything without fail. So he has to deliver 200% on the job as well, and somehow miraculously handle the transformation as well, which is not possible. So, and you are not even willing to give him additional resources as a team to support him in that. You at the end of the day, unfortunately, what happens is that the company expects that people, instead of people, donkeys need to run the transformation.
That's right.
And
That's
this
right.
is what happening. So that is then the second part, definitely, that if you're going towards transformation and the change management, you talked about systems and people. I would like to talk about the process as well. The process change management has to be there. That the processes that you are having right now, are they the right processes which need to go into the transformation, and you need to change those as well. Is someone assessing them right now? For example, we are in a discussion with one company that they are going through a transformation, and we are talking about that how we need to reassess their existing processes, help them rewrite the whole processes based on their vision, which is 5 to 10 years vision, so that they are ready for the future. The same process cannot work. So I just wanted to add my few cents to your, on top to what you just said, to compliment you.
Yeah, no, I think absolutely spot on.
Perfect. See, the reason I'm talking like this is that this is a topic very close to me as well. So I like our discussions to be more of a chat between two buddies on a topic close at heart, rather than interview process.
That's right. And maybe, one more thing, which might be a segue into probably your next question as well, Noman, which is a lot of times, so the question then becomes, okay, how do you do all of this, right? Because of course, like I think we have identified the problem, why it failed, right? But how to solve it, right? And then one more thing, as you get into the executional part of the transformation, right? What I've seen is that I think every company understands the importance of having like an operational steer co or a transformation steer co, where you bring in the right people and then they are having the right conversations. But the pitfall there is that then you end up in a little bit of a analysis paralysis thing, because then if you have like 15 other projects going on, then I've seen examples in my past where there are like 7 different steer cos with the same group of people or different group of people, right? And the analogy I give to people when I see that is that imagine when you're learning how to drive a car. If you have ever like taken like those formal lessons, they will take you into a car where there are 2 steerings, right? Where like the instructor can override the car in case you are making a mistake. So if you're running like 10 different steer codes in the same company and there are different things going on, it becomes that car where there are too many drivers trying to steer the ship, and then the ship goes nowhere, right? So I think that's a very important executional thing to think about. Like if you are really doing a transformation, it should be the focus. There should be maybe one steer co where all the decisions are made, and then those decisions then are also respected. And then the other very common execution pitfall, one, is the lack of key user programs in companies, right? So there is literally no focus, even in the most established companies in the world, on having a very clear program on who are the functional experts in the company, who are, and I see this as in three layers, by the way. You need to have functional experts, you need to have key users, and then you need to have end users. What happens is, because nobody invests in that training capability or tracking on how people are trained and are they even capable, what ends up happening is that your key users are never able to deliver the transformation because they struggle, they don't even know enough. So your end users and your key users end up becoming your the work of your end users, and then the RFEs are also pulled into the day-to-day discussion, right? And this is where a lot of things fail. So one of the things which I would recommend, of course, you do so many projects in your line of business, is that before we even get and talk about, okay, what are we transforming, we need to understand, like, who are the functional expert in this company, right? Who are the key users and who are the end users? And then, is there a visible tracker that if someone leaves the business, right, are we really backfilling that skill? Are we really identifying that, okay, there is a skill gap now that we need to address? Because then if this happens across like 5 or 6 different positions, then it's all over the place.
Correct. And I will just add on a small perspective to what you just said. You're right, the three layers that need to be, training when you are doing a transformation. So, okay, fine, everything went well. You did the go live, but the go live happens without the end user training. Somehow you said we will do the training of the so-called functional or the key, the master users, those guys, and they will train internally, and that never happens. They never train, because how can you train someone by taking a training for a topic only once without using the system for a few months, and then you cannot expect them to train the end users. So somehow the end users always get missed in the training programs somehow. And a good transformation needs to have all the users go through an intensive training, that it's not just one, multiple times, understanding each and every function, whatever they are doing and how it aligning, and what way they were doing and how they need to do that change management to the new one. So coming to now, as you said, is a segue to the next question. So I will ask over here that from a perspective from supply chain leaders who are leading transformation, and from the governance perspective, that how do they align different functions in that? We talked about the hierarchy of the users, but internally as well, you talked about multiple steer codes happening as well. So, but how do you align all the functions that they all have that buy-in into the project?
Yeah, so I think there are two parts of that, right? So first of all, when the project is being, let's say, in early stages, when the project is being designed or being approved, right, that needs to involve leaders from every single function. Now, typically in supply chain, I'll tell you, because in a company there could be lots of different functions. I think any transformation in supply chain, regardless of how much interaction it has with some of these other functions, it's always going to fail if it doesn't have the buy-in from the CFO, because finance is always involved in supply chain, no matter what you do. Second person would be your CIO or your IT director, whatever the title is, like whoever is leading your technology function, right? And then the third role would be your GM and your sales. These four people, even if, let's say, the transformation is not even touching sales, they need to be on board, and they need to sign off on the fact that this is a priority for the business, and this is how it's going to consume resources, and we will not be doing certain things because we want to support these functions. And because of the same reason, as the project gets on its feet, these four functions should be a part of every single steerco, because they should know. And the reason I'm bringing sales in this is that the relationship between sales and supply chain is so integral. And if something goes wrong, the first people to feel it finance will feel it at the month close, right? Or maybe at the weekly inventory snapshot and all of that stuff, right? But sales is going to feel it immediately when this happens, right? So they need to be on board on what's happening, and they need to also do this. So one more thing, Noman, I should have mentioned this when we were talking about change management earlier. Change management also has the external component, right? So there's internal change management, but then how is it going to affect your customer? So let's say if you have got your top 5 customers who are, representing 80% of your revenue, and if you are bringing a major change which possibly changes the way they are going to place the orders or where they are going to get stuff from, you have to ensure that at least 90 or 120 days before your actual go live, you
Right.
bring your customer on board and tell them, hey, we are doing this. Here are 3 ways and it's going to impact you. It's not a big deal or it's a big deal, whatever that is, and make sure that your customer is on board. Because I have seen, I actually, I've got like scars on my back because of that, right? Because I've been in projects where we did not do this and we really learned the hard way. But then I, took some of those learnings and we did it the right way the next time. And it makes a night and day difference, because when your customer is on board, Noman, they become, and they understand why you are doing this transformation, because they can see like, what's in it for them. They become your ambassadors for the change as well, which makes your conversations a lot easy with your internal GMs and, sales directors and so on and so forth. So I think that's a very important piece to consider as well.
Correct. I will add just two angles to it. The first one, when you talk about sales, during my operation, when I used to still be a corporate employee, fine, I learned one very interesting thing during my days, that I was in Pakistan, and the MD asked our sales director, I was heading the supply chain, that the sales director, that take Noman to your top 5 customers. Fine, and I have never interacted directly. It's not our role was to manage the factory, the operations, the planning, everything. But I was taking to meet the top 5 customers, and the idea was that Noman need to listen how they perceive us as a supplier,
Right.
and what are the problems they are facing, and how can then supply chain address the problems head on. And that made a huge difference. That once I started listening in, and this is what I'm saying, that what you said, the sales buy-in, everything. So it's not just the sales. On the other hand, the supply chain buy-in needs to be there with the sales as well. As you said, that they have to work in cohesion, in synergy, and everything. So it made a difference that I went back to the floor and I started talking about the customer for the very first time. Nobody has talked about the customer. And we started changing priorities, that we got to know that, okay, this customer is not big orders, but we know that if we deliver on this order, we are expecting a much bigger order. And that is how, everything changed. The dynamic on the floor changed. So one thing I wanted to share this over here, that again, this is again a change that we brought in. The other part is, you talk about the external. When we talk about transformation projects in supply chain, I say one thing, irrespective of which area you are doing the transformation, maybe procurement, maybe warehouse, maybe transport, the one person or one function that needs to be involved every time is the planning, because they have the pulse of the whole supply chain. They know exactly when and what can go wrong, what is the impact and everything. So I've always tried to make the planning team part of every transformation project, because they can, they have their sixth sense, which can identify something is about to go wrong or will go wrong. So planning is critical to every project there.
Planning is the nerve center, and I mentioned this in my coaching calls and videos as well, Noman, and with of course, like the caution that, because I've done planning for the majority of my career, right? So I'm probably emotionally attached to planning, but planning is the nerve center of supply chain. If planning is wrong, everything will be definitely wrong. If planning is right, things could be right, hopefully, right? But if you're planning, if you have got issues in your planning process, or like you said, if your planners are not on board with your transformation or whatever work you're doing, it's going to be a disaster. Let's be very honest about it.
Yes, exactly. So you're right. It's the nerve center, it's the umbrella function, it's the interconnecting, the chain links or the chain locks of the whole supply chain. It connects the chains. So planning is critical. So coming to my next question for you is that when implementing major changes, such as it may be WMS, APS, or a complete end-to-end supply chain visibility solutions, now too much is happening in the supply chain world. Previously people only knew that SAP is there, Oracle is there, but now you have very customized and very focused supply chain solutions available now in the likes of Manhattan, Blue Yonders, Slim Stock, and others as well. that you have. So, what are the critical success factors, in your opinion, that can ensure adoption, stability, and sustain performance improvements?
Yeah, I'll keep this one very simple, Noman, because if the people are viewing this podcast want to take away like two things from this question. One would be that whenever you are implementing a system, let's say you are bringing a new planning system or a WMS, first of all, you need to find out who are your internal change agents who will become your ambassadors for that change. Because then you need to find at least a couple of people who are who believe in the new system you are bringing in, and they can talk to their operational peers or their direct reports and so on about the benefits of the system. They can become your internal salesman. You can go as a transformation leader and you can deliver one full day of presentations and try to sell it, right? But if there is your most critical guy in the warehouse says that, oh, you know what, I've used this WMS before and it's crap, right? It's not going to work. You will struggle, right? Because then people will listen to that person more than to you, right? So first of all is you need to have that mindset that you need to find those change agents. Secondly, the other thing where I think a lot of times there is a struggle is that your technical hypercare when you go live with these systems, Noman, has to be differentiated from your operational hypercare. Because your technical hypercare, the way typically IT does it, okay, we are going to go live. This is the week when the code is going to go into production. Now we are live, we'll do a 2-week hypercare and then, off we go. And then after that, anything happens, you submit a ticket to in this system and, all of that stuff. But if it's a major systems change, let's say you are, completely changing your WMS or your APS, right? You need to have a longer, what I call as the operational hypercare, which means that you need to keep some of those business people who are on the project for a longer period of time, so that they can do the necessary hand holding and close some of those gaps that we talked about earlier. I know maybe you don't have the right key users, you don't have the right end users, right? So one way to compensate for that problem, Noman, which I've seen works very nicely, is that you have your operational hypercare team, or let's say a few people, staying on the business for a longer period of time, because those people who are the bridges between the project technical side and the business side, they are your linchpin to your success. Because when, let's say, something goes live and you see something going wrong, those people will get the first, like you said, the sixth sense, but because they have been in the whole journey, right? So they can tell you exactly, they can put the finger on the wound that this is where it could have gone wrong. So I think those are the two big pieces to consider, or those are the success factors. I mean, we can of course talk about KPIs and all of that, but I'm giving you like more practical tips for your viewers that they can take away.
Okay. No. I agree on that. Yes, the hypercare is very important. That people think that somehow the hypercare given by the company who's implementing the transformation is more than enough. But you need to have an internal hypercare as well.
That's right.
That they depend too much on the external part and they ignore the internal part. And unfortunately, these are the, and rightly said, these lead to failures even post go live as well. That suddenly what happens is that the people within the organization stop using it fully, and they just start using it with the areas which they are comfortable with.
That's right.
So now suddenly you have invested in 100% solution, and the company is only utilizing bits and parts of it.
That's right. Yeah, I've seen examples, Noman, where companies have spent like thousands and thousands and probably sometimes millions of dollars on developing, like, say, DRP solutions, and then after a year of implementation, you go back and you find out that your planners are using Excel to do their distribution planning still, right? And then you ask them what happened. So because they did not know what went wrong, they just defaulted back to Excel, and they started doing because the person who was actually the key user was a much better, much more knowledgeable at running Excel macros versus learning the system, right? So I've seen those examples as well.
So the next question is about the quick wins for the organization. But before I talk about that, recently as SCT, we have just embarked upon a new journey where we are launching our own product into the market, an AI solution, and it's a procurement intelligence engine that we are launching. It's so, and believe me, that what we are talking about, we are trying to ensure that that transformation is kind of built in into the whole solution offering. That the frictionless transformations can happen. So now coming to the second part is, and I will connect with you on a separate note. I would like to take some pointers and some your thoughts, that is the solution worth it or not. You operate in a completely different environment in a market. So maybe what we are seeing as a problem statement over here might not be a problem statement in that market. So I will definitely connect with you separately on that one.
Absolutely.
So
Maybe, we can go through the other questions, Noman, but maybe in the end, if we have time, I want to touch a little bit upon this whole, like how AI can really change the game on this whole ecosystem.
done.
Pretty
So
soon.
I'm writing AI as question number 9.
Yeah.
Fine. So coming back. So again, how can organization balance the quick wins because and with long-term capability building? Because whenever you talk about transformation, the thing is that to show to the management, let's focus on the initial quick wins so that the management and the steerco are happy, and then we focus on the long-term capability building and everything. So where do you think that how does this pan out from a whole project timeline perspective?
That's a very good question. The first thing is one common mistake companies do, Noman, is that when a transformation project is sanctioned, they try to put it through their existing, let's say, PMO or project management structure, right? Which could be a big mistake, because normally those project management structures are very good to deliver continuous improvement work, right? Okay, I'm going to do this CI, and it's like, and the bigger the company, the more bureaucratic that process becomes. If you have a major transformation, you need to be doing this outside of that bureaucracy, right? So you need to take out the red tape first. That's one. Secondly, at the very beginning of the project, you need to really challenge yourself hard and think about where can I get the quick wins. Because if this project is something which is going to just take 3 years to get on the ground, then you are going to lose support on this really fast, right? So the key point there would be at the very beginning of the project, when the scope is being defined. You need to think about, okay, where are those quick wins, and are we looking for what kind of quick wins are we really looking for? Is service a bigger challenge? Is cost a bigger challenge? Or is inventory a bigger challenge? And where can we really deliver some of those? Because what's the difference between, let's say, a transformation program and an individual project, right? A transformation program is basically a series of micro projects, right? So a lot of different things that come together will make the overall piece of the puzzle look like a transformation. So what are those pieces of the puzzle where you can deliver faster, get results quicker, and gain the confidence of your leadership or your steerco, so that they keep believing in the program? I think that would be my 2 cents on that.
Okay, no, perfect. I agree with you on this. So, building on that, then we talked about people and everything that leaders needs to be there. So, in your opinion, what role does talent development and capability building play in transformation success? How can organizations scale training and change readiness across large supply networks?
Right. Yeah. The easiest way to remember this is, I have like the 3E model. When you think about talent, especially for transformation, the 3Es are engagement, enabling, and empowerment, right? So going back to my earlier point, Noman, as you need to identify your internal change ambassadors, who are your key users, who are the experts, and then you need to first of all engage them on the transformation, so that they believe, like, okay, this can really work. Second one would be, like, enable them. Like, if there are any gaps in capabilities, they need to learn a new system, or they need to spend more time with the developer, understanding how this works versus the previous tool they were using. Enable them, and then empower them. Let them, give them the independence and the latitude to make decisions. Where, because in every implementation, Oman, I think, let's be very careful here. Again, a good implementation, you will be doing like 20% customization, right? But that customization needs to be done right. Like, and these are the people who need to be empowered to do that. If you are doing 80% customization, then you are implementing the wrong tool, by the way, right? But if you are doing 20% customization, but then what is that 20% going to look like is these people who are your technical experts, they need to be in the driving seat. So I would just to recap again, engage, enable, empower the people. And that's how and if you do these three things, then you will also be able to retain that talent, because this talent that gets developed during a transformation, the cost of losing this talent is much higher than cost of losing someone who is just an operational person who just left the business, right? Because now these people not only know how your operation runs, but they have lived through a major change, so they can contribute a lot to your breakthrough thinking, which I think is a non-negotiable in the world of supply chain nowadays, because things are changing so fast.
Correct. Agree with you. And I have noted this down, the three E's. This is something, a new learning for me, and I will keep it at heart. Maybe I'll do a small vlog, and I will credit it to Jameel as well on that one. So I'm already letting you know that I will steal this from you now.
No problem.
Right. So thank you. And I also like the initial terminology of dialogue, the day in life of. That's a new terminology for me, to be honest. So I will also be taking that away from this one.
Oh yeah, no. Dialogue is. I think this is so important, Noman, right? Because the dialogue, like it really helps you think about. Okay, just imagine you're think of an APS, right? So today your planner works in a certain way on your current APS.
Yeah.
Tomorrow it's going to be a new APS. It's bringing in new capabilities. So you need to sit down with every key role in the business. What that APS is going to do for your MRP planner? What is it going to do for your DRP planner? What is it going to do for your capacity planner, right? Those kind of things, right? So you need to think about what is the to and the from, because that will basically create your training content from there, like what you need to upskill them on.
Correct. And now coming to that, from that, and you mentioned KPIs as well earlier. So in a transformation programs, from your opinion, what KPIs best reflect real progress? And recently, the one that I was talking to you about, the intelligent engine that we are building, we were pitching it yesterday, on Thursday actually, and we received a query from the CIO that can you also define that what will be the KPI impacts, that which KPI will it help improve for the organization? The first question which came from the CIO was around KPI. So now my question again would be that what KPIs best reflect real progress in a transformation, and the value created beyond service and cost, in your opinion?
Yeah. So this is a very slippery slope, Noman, right? Because you can easily go on two extreme ends of the spectrum here. Because I've seen examples where, because everybody's trying to define KPIs, and then that becomes very quickly into like a race of creating new KPIs. And then you get into something which is very well explained in this book called Lean Startup, right? That you get into a lot of vanity metrics, right? So in supply chain, there are so many vanity metrics. I think we can do a separate podcast about that. But at the end of the day, Noman, it's about, like, supply chain is all about what is the value you are delivering to your customer, right? So if it's around reduction of lead time, if it's around, I'm not going to touch on cost, cash, and service. I think that's a given, right? But then what is the benefit of the customer? Maybe as a result of this transformation, you'll massively reduce the transit time to your customer, or you are going to, your order lead time, the order to shipment time, let's say, used to be 10 days. Now it's going to be 2 days as a result of that. So those need to be very brutally and clearly defined, so that the more brutally you define them, the easier it will be to measure them, right? And then, of course, there are some of your standard, let's say, your KPIs as you kind of do the transition. How many open issues are there closed in the hypercare and all of that? How many defects are there and all of that stuff, right? But then I think at the end of the day, you need to really go back to what customer value this transformation is creating, and that's how you measure it. And this is where that customer engagement piece becomes so important too.
Okay. So what we will do is, since we have received a question which is related to the KPIs topic, so I'll just take that question from Matthew. Matthew was on our podcast on Thursday. No, it was Wednesday, I think, if I'm not mistaken, Wednesday. So here you go. So this is question from Matthew. He is the founder and CEO of Logic I. It's a end-to-end freight management solution. So he's asking for learning what all will be the in-fit care plans and KPIs that you will focus to ensure that the transformation is progressing on the right decision and as planned.
Yeah. So I think we kind of touched on is that, I think
Yeah,
what Matthew is referring to as infant care is what I was talking about as hypercare, right? And I think that
happy.
the hypercare needs you have to make a very clear, let's say, proclamation with your business that hypercare is not the way the hypercare is normally defined by IT, right? Which is typically 1 week, 2 week, maybe 3 weeks if you're lucky. Your infant care, and I like actually the term infant care, Matthew, so thanks for sharing that, right? Your infant care is basically, your infant care will be successful when your infant becomes like, a toddler from an infant as a result of that transformation, right? Just to use that same terminology there. So that is where that operational hypercare piece that we covered earlier in the podcast, I think that's the answer to the question. And then the KPIs piece, which we just covered, is that, don't get into the fallacy of creating a lot of transformational KPIs which you will measure, like, just measure what is important in your customer journey. One example I can give you, like, so when we started the most recent project I'm working on, I got a list. When I inherited the project, I got a list of, I think, about 200 KPIs that we will be measuring. I said, no way on earth we will be measuring 200 KPIs. And then we started doing a little bit of a quick audit, right? So there are, for example, one of the KPIs was that number of order lines. And I said, okay, number of order lines, I like the KPI, but what is our customer really complaining about the number of order lines? And if they are not, then I would not even track it. It has nothing to do with the transformation we are doing. So you just need to, whichever, setup you are working in, Matthew, my recommendation would be that just go back to the core fundamental principle of what is driving value for your customer. And I can assure you that you will come back with very simplistic answers, right? And then define your KPIs around them versus creating KPIs for the sake of KPIs, because that's a very common trap that the supply chain people fall into.
Perfect. Thanks. So before we step into the discussion on the AI, I will just ask the last question from you, and then we'll go into the AI topic. So based on your experience, so Jameel, you have, apart from the eastern side of the globe, you have basically handled everything from Pakistan to UAE and then to Canada. So from that perspective, from such a global perspective, working in different environment, working in different supply chains, what practical advice would you give as a supply chain leader to other leaders who are aiming to translate supply chain strategy into consistent execution results? So your advice to them.
Yeah, I think you mentioned this earlier in the podcast, Noman, and I think my answer is gonna double click on that. That that whole people process tool structure is evergreen. And one thing I can share from my perspective is that because supply chain skills or challenges are very common, right? Uh, you see a very clear thread between a problem you see in Pakistan versus then you see it in the US. Some context changes right now. For example, like, when I was in Pakistan, it was a very distributor oriented market. So those challenges are a bit different than what I see today with a Costco or with a Walmart, right? But then at the end of the day, when you do the 5 why analysis and you start root causing on what's driving some of the challenges, they are alarmingly similar, by the way, right? Which is one of the advantages of being in supply chain, because generally if you're a supply chain practitioner and you have not like married yourself to a specific system, then your skills are very transferable globally. So coming back to your question quickly is, if you are a leader who is influencing your strategy or defining a strategy, then the number one thing I will suggest is start with your customer. That is the number. You need to have that customer focus. And I'm so glad you mentioned earlier, Oman, that in your job earlier, they sent you to the customer. Because I tell one more thing, which is, I know we are getting a little bit into like this career counseling ideas here, but people ask me this one of the most commonly asked questions on my channel is that, how do I get to a more senior level in supply chain? And then typically the mindset is that, oh, I need to know this tool and all of that. And I tell them that there are two things which will turn you from a supply chain manager to a director or a VP, which is, you need to really have a good understanding of your customer. And the second thing is that you need to have a very good understanding of your company's P&L, not just your logistics conversion cost, not just your storage and everything, but you need to know, even as a small supply chain manager working in a corner of a company, that how much money are we spending on advertising and media, how much money are we spending on other parts of the business. Because the more cross functional lens you will develop earlier on in your career, the faster you will make it to the top. Because otherwise, like, supply chain will always keep you busy, and then you will just get sucked up into your own specific KPIs and issues, and you will lose that overall sense. So, the same thing applies on your strategy building as well. Like, understand your customer, and then once you know, okay, what is the problem you're solving, this is another very important thing. Once you understand your customer problem, then identify the right problem you are solving. One of the most underestimated skills, especially with senior leaders, is writing a good problem statement. Trust me, it looks very straightforward, but 9 out of 10 times I've seen, like, people don't define the problem properly. Once you have done that, then go back to your, okay, how will you solve that problem across your people, process, and tools? That simple as that, right? So no need to overcomplicate this.
Perfect. So as you requested that at the end you will like to talk about AI, so I'm giving the floor to you. So share your thoughts on this part.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not surprised, Noman, that at Supply Chain Talks, you guys are also trying to build like a more in-house tool, because I think this is where, in fact, like just a couple of days ago, I recorded a podcast with another supply chain practitioner, and I'm seeing these cases more and more. Like, that there is this trend of practitioner-driven AI tools, and now they are coming to that inflection point that they are beginning to challenge these, heavy overweights, and I don't want to take any names on your podcast because
I will also not.
right? So, but this is where I think we are still not there, that like a practitioner built AI tool might challenge like a juggernaut APS system. But we are getting there slowly, because now more and more I can see that if you know what is, once again, going back to the problem statement, right? If you know the right problem you're trying to resolve, and you upskill yourself on the right AI skills, Claude, and you don't even need to write the code anymore, but you need to define the problem very well, right?
Yes,
so I think we are getting slowly to that point, Noman, that in the next 5 years, a lot of these implementation lead times could be shrunk. It could be done faster. I have a feeling, and I might be wrong here, right? So just take my feeling with a pinch of salt. This transformation you will see more in mid-sized companies than massive big players, because the problem with these big juggernaut companies in the industry is that they are tied up with these big IT solution providers, which of course they will keep pushing their certain software, right? But there is something which is happening at the grassroots levels, which could very soon pull the rug from that whole setup, right?
You're right, and Jameel, that is what is happening. That they are challenging the status quo. I respect all of them. We work with, as City, we are represented partners to a lot of these global supply chain solutions from US, Netherlands, Europe, India, Pakistan, different areas, and I see a lot of good solutions coming out of Pakistan. India is already, a huge market, so already a lot of solutions coming out of India have that certain level of maturity, because their test base is so huge that even if they are able to fulfill, be successful in India, the population sample size is mega. So they are good. But you are rightly that now people like you and I, who are not tech savvy, in the sense that who are not coders and everything, AI itself is allowing us to build MVPs now.
That's right.
And it is helping with, as you mentioned, Claude, Gemini, with ChatGPT and other solutions. Now, what we have as ideas, they can be much better structured as outputs now, because now we have the world's information at a single prompt. With a single prompt, we can extract a lot of good data, which we still need to, verify. We still need to go through. We cannot trust blindly. But a lot of coming. Now you do not need to hire these big consultancy firms as well, because now you can get data from publicly available information that is there. So at least the first 2-3 steps are already ready to be deployed. And you're right. And as
there is a very common. I mean, it's a debate. I would not still call it a misconception, because it's still a debate, and I'm a part of that debate as well. That in order, before you even implement AI, you need to first do your basics, clean your data, and all of that stuff, right? And that could be a trap again, right? because one of the very interesting things which my guest mentioned a couple of days ago is that you need to look at AI as your developer. You don't need to look at you. If you start thinking your AI is going to be your planner, that's where you are making a big mistake,
Yeah,
because you will still be the eventual decision maker with that data is going to be your team, or your supply chain folks, right?
100%.
So it's basically taking away that whole complexity of, oh, now I need to depend on an IT department where it's going to take them like 3 years to build a solution for me. I can actually, if I know what problem I'm solving, I might be able to build a solution myself, which is a huge, huge enabler for supply chain people. And I think this is why we are seeing, and this is a bit of a digression, Noman, but I'll just touch on this. One of the reasons why we are seeing more jobs lost in the IT function, or let's say IT sector, than other functions yet, or other industries yet, is because unfortunately in this case IT or technology is becoming the victim of its own medicine, right? Because IT is kind of, you can do all those things that your typical IT manager would do, you can do it yourself, and those jobs are becoming redundant faster. The reason why it's going to take some time for a lot of repetitive jobs to be replaced in supply chain, which is already happening by the way, is because the thing which will be very hard for AI to replace is that if you are solving a different problem every day, which is, the story of our lives in our industry, right? So that's where it will be very difficult for a bot to resolve that. So if you know what those, themes of those problems are, and you know how to do the development part, I think that is where the change is already happening. We are just, beginning to feel it.
Yeah, and I just add one small thing to it, and then we'll try to take a few questions. You know, till a few years back, at least till last year, I was so heavily dependent, and I need to have someone good in finance who can manage my books, and a commercial guy who can help me, put up the right offers and everything. Now, what is happening is what I recently learned, and I started training myself on, these AI tools, different ChatGPT, Claude, and these things. And I got to know that I don't need these things, because just a few days back, I was sitting with someone, with the CEO of a company over logistics, and we were looking into certain things, and we basically built a whole 3-year financial outlook by giving the right prompts, giving the right assumptions and everything in a matter of 40 minutes.
That's right.
With an Excel output which had the guide, which had the input fields and everything, so we can play around with that financial outlook. That I changed one thing, the whole financial, my 3-year financials and everything. It was a complete, and previously I had to pay a lot of money for someone to build it for me, and that person had to take time and everything. Now I'm just prompting for example, ChatGPT now.
That's right. That's right.
So now you are right. Hopefully, we will still be there in the market, but
Yeah, that will be the challenge, right? Like,
but we have to
who's gonna
evolve.
stay?
But we have to evolve as well.
That's right.
And that is true. Irrespective of the function, now the functions have to evolve. AI is a reality. Technology is a reality, and if you are not aligned with it, and if you are not using it correctly within your own function, then you are obsolete now.
That is right. That is right. It reminds me, I mean, that may be a good way to also like conclude this podcast before we take the questions. Noman, is that, one of my guests on, we did a podcast on, AI trends in supply chain a few months ago on my channel. And she mentioned that, AI is not going to take your job. Somebody knowing AI is going to take your job. So stop fearing AI, start embracing it.
Exactly. And I will end. So I do one statement. AI is an enabler. Or not an enabler anymore. Sorry, my statement is usually that AI is not an enabler, it's an amplifier. So if you are good, it makes you great. If you are bad, it makes you shit.
That's right.
As simple as that.
I like that. Yeah.
So thank you again. So let's take a few questions. And so we'll have our first question is from IBO 8349. Would you also not implement checkpoints to ensure we're going in the right direction, or need to change certain aspects to still achieve proposed goal? Now, this is related to transformation.
Yeah, and I think the simple answer is yes, and it goes back to the point I was talking about, the steer course, right? So your steer co meetings. First of all, you don't need to have multiple steer courses, right? So you need to have one ideally, or maybe a couple maximum if you're working on a very complicated thing. And those steer codes should meet at least, if not more, once a month, where and I think one of the important points in those steer co meetings is that kind of goes back to your checkpoint point, is that try not to have this mindset of hiding problems from your steer co. Try to be open about it. And the people who are sitting on the decision making roles on those steer cos also need to create that safe environment where people are open to share problems, right? One of the problems I've seen is that each time you bring up a problem, there is so much noise and fuss around it, and then in a lot of companies, depending on their culture, sometimes it becomes like a negative communication spiral. That is a cultural thing that the leaders have to ensure it never happens, so that people feel safe. If some bad thing has happened in your project, you should have the courage, and you should feel safe enough to come and raise those points in those checkout calls.
Okay, great. Thanks. So we have one more question from Matthew. Will the current regional disruption will speed up or delay the decision on digital transformation in supply chain?
Yeah, I think current regional disruption, any disruption, in my opinion, and this is based on like some hard experiences from the past, is always going to accelerate your need to transform your supply chain in some shape or form. Because imagine right now with this whole issue going on, there will be new implications on the long term profitability of companies. Your P&L structures could change, your cost structures could change. I don't know what's going to happen with the price of gas in the long term, right? But then we'll all have to embrace to the new reality. And what that's going to do is that once you have a new uh, kind of driver in your KPI, you will be forced to offset it with some kind of a technology solution or some kind of a smart idea, right? So I think it's these disruptions do nothing but they accelerate. I mean, COVID is a great example. A lot of supply chain transformation got accelerated after COVID because it was a massive disruption. So
So I think we'll just have one last question, and then we'll move towards our closing for the day. This one again from Matthew. He asks, if you decide to bring digital transformation in supply chain, which are the first 3-4 areas you will focus on phase one?
yeah, that's a very good question, Matthew. And I think the first and the foremost area would be defining your problem which you're resolving, trying to solve. Make sure that problem, is fully aligned. And then the second step would be to define your current state and your future state in as much of a detail as possible. This is where, Noman, I think you kind of touched on it earlier. Your process mapping becomes super important, right? That you need to be able to identify on a value stream map that, okay, these are the problems we are solving in our supply chain, so that then this is my from and my to state. And the more clearly you define it, and try to go at as much detail as possible, by the way, in those first 3 to 4 phases, right? Sometimes you define it at a very executive level, but then when you translate it down, it becomes a challenge. So especially in supply chain, the ones where I've seen success stories is where you define that future state process, if possible, even at the interface level. Because then when you are doing your implementation and execution and your testing and something fails, exactly, you can go and actually pinpoint on your future state process map that, this interface is failing, and that is why I'm unable to implement or something like that. So I would say, define your problem and then map your process, how you're doing it today and how would you like to do it tomorrow, in as much detail as possible. And then the last thing, is don't forget the people change management aspect that we've already covered in detail.
Correct. So this basically brings us to the end. So thank you, Jameel. I will just share some my closing thoughts on it. So again, to close this session today, first and foremost, Jameel, thank you very much for sharing your insights with us today. It was wonderful talking to you. This has been definitely a highly relevant and practical conversation, and I'm sure that our audience have taken away, and they will in future, because it will be available online as well, valuable perspectives on what it is truly means to lead supply chain transformation from a strategy through to execution. So in today's discussion, clearly highlighted that successful transformation requires much more than a strong business case. It requires disciplined governance, cross-functional alignment, capability building, adoption. We talked about the three E's. We talked about the day in life of, and the ability to measure progress in ways that reflect resilience, agility, and long-term value addition. And we also touched upon what are the potential right KPIs, not get bogged down, identify the right KPIs that you need to review and measure. To everyone who joined us live, thank you for being part of this session. We sincerely appreciate your time, your interest, and your continued support of Supply Chain Talk. Please stay connected with us for more webinars, industry conversation, and professional learning opportunity. You can also follow Supply Chain Talks on LinkedIn and YouTube. On YouTube, I would appreciate if you can click like and subscribe. And we would greatly appreciate it if you share this session within your professional networks. On behalf of Supply Chain Talks, thank you once again, especially Jameel, and a very special thank you to all our live listeners. This is Noman Ali signing off. Have a wonderful evening, and we look forward to seeing you again soon in another Supply Chain Talks session. Thank you. Bye-bye. Assalamu alaikum.